Really?
It's enjoyable.
Oh, that's loud. All right, folks, so who wants to talk about schizophrenia today? We're going to learn about, you guys know about schizophrenia, right? We'll talk about antipsychotic drugs, not a big deal. Tons of stuff. We're going to spend a lot of time not actually on like drugs to treat schizophrenia, but we'll talk about some of the theories and models of schizophrenia, and I think that's important because it gives you some insight into what's going on, right? No, we don't have to worry about this too much. So, this is not a mistake you guys make, I'm certain right now, because you guys have fixed it. But how many of you hear people use the word schizophrenic in the wrong way constantly? Yeah, right? It's like, oh man, he's got that split personality thing, I'm schizophrenic. Well, none of that sentence was correct. But I'm not going to bother to tell you because neither of your personalities are going to get it. So get out of my way and let me buy my bread and eggs. So schizophrenic, I mean, what's the number one thing that's going to happen to you? You're going to be hearing voices. Those voices are going to tell you to do stuff you shouldn't be doing typically, right? Or they're going to be telling you to do stuff you should do, but in no way are you qualified to do it, right? Okay, it's habits. You get you hear the voices, you get unrealistic ideas, you have those delusions, right? Like, oh man, I'm going to save the world. No, you're not. Well, something in your head's telling you that, certainly, but you're probably not, you don't have things organized well enough to do that right now. So there are a lot of things going on. Thought disorder, right? So these disorganized sort of thoughts, not able to get things together. There are sort of three large categories of symptoms when we think about schizophrenia, right? We think about the positive, and positive doesn't mean they're good. Positive just means they're present. Negative is things that are absent, right? That should be there. And then you sort of have your cognitive aspects as well, right? So you kind of like a three-pronged approach there to this. So there you go. So schizophrenia is another one of these stories. Like, well, we can treat it a little bit. We can control some of the symptoms, not all of the symptoms. But definitely we don't know how to cure it and or prevent it, right? So most of the time you're going to get your onset of schizophrenia early, right? Teenage, early 20s. There is an exception to that, and that's if you have a couple of X chromosomes, right? Because then you have that kind of little blip later in life where there's an uptick. And that's kind of interesting because there's actually some sort of idea that estrogen is actually neuroprotective, right? In some way, estrogen levels protect you from developing schizophrenia. And there are a couple lines of evidence to show that this, Carmen, is probably true. One is this sort of later in life uptick in the sort of incidence rate of schizophrenia in women. What happens to women later in life? We didn't talk about this aspect. What was that?
They dry up.
That's your ovary going into retirement right there. I love this. Is that the international symbol? My ovaries don't work. You just clench your fist.
It's like a fruit.
So there you go. Something to look forward to. At least it'll save you money on condoms. So you got that to look forward to. Oh yeah, wow, think about that, right? All kinds of things you don't have to buy anymore. I mean, you do have to start buying the bladder leak things, but so maybe you're not really saving on the tampon side. So there you go. Yeah, sorry. I mean to like burst the bubble there. But that uptick happens, in menopause. You're starting to have a decrease in the output of estrogen. The other line of evidence on this is that in females, there's a negative correlation between the onset of schizophrenia and the age of onset for puberty. If you go into puberty sooner, you're less likely to develop schizophrenia later in life. And again, that's because you have more estrogen for a longer period of time. So I don't know, it's kind of an interesting, nobody really thinks about that, right? Sort of as a side note, we'll talk about this in a few moments. I kind of want to think about like treatments. One of the major side effects for some of the antipsychotics is overdevelopment of breast and lactation even in men. So there you go, some other kind of interesting, that's through the prolactin system. That's kind of a cool connection there, right? So there you go.
So if you take birth control for a longer period of time and you just have more estrogen stored up in your body, will that also help delay the onset of schizophrenia? Like if that runs in your family and you have a higher chance of developing it?
You know, that's a possibility. I wouldn't go out and recommend that.
Right.
You know, not being someone who can recommend those kinds of medical things that you should do. Got in trouble the last time I told you guys to do LSD. So I'm going to be careful. I'm not telling you to go out and use birth control. Actually, I probably am telling you to go out and use birth control. I'm not telling you to go out and use hormonal birth control. Cassie, and this is something to think about, sort of indirectly related to this class. The offset there, or the thing to consider is, so let's keep taking birth control later in life. There's also a sort of an increase, though, in the likelihood of like stroke if you continue to take hormonal birth control later in life, right? So you've got that trade-off. You should think about that. But there's hormone replacement therapy, right? So that's something else that you know might be a consideration post-menopause if you know that schizophrenia is an issue in your family. Something to think about. Not really an option for half the population out there, but possibly works for half, right? So there you go. Here's sort of the age of onset of folks. You can see for the most part, men sort of outpace women until you get past that, kind of mid-30s point, and then females take over, being more likely, even up until the mid to late 70s, right? Women can develop schizophrenia, which is we always think about it primarily as that, young adult sort of situation, but definitely can still happen.
How would you tell the difference between schizophrenia and like dementia?
Yeah,
They're
right.
75 and over.
Yeah, that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And so,
What if they have both?
what if they have both?
I heard a voice, but I didn't remember what it said.
Then I think you're okay because you're not going to go out and do it. It's like,
Automatic.
that voice told me to run over somebody, but then I forgot where it told me to go, so stay home. That's actually a good question. Schizophrenia also, there are other things that can sort of seem like schizophrenia as well. In particular, like the positive symptoms are pretty obvious, right? So if someone is 75 and they try to tell you, they're some deity or whatever, that's probably not they've forgotten who they are, right? And that seems like schizophrenia to me. If they don't remember where they live, that's maybe dementia, right? So the positive symptoms are easier to pick out. What the problem though is you're right about those like negative symptoms and the cognitive symptoms, right? If an old guy's got or old woman has a thought disorder, that becomes difficult, right? To kind of parse that out. There are probably a couple things you can do. Try them on an antipsychotic. It's always worth it, right? Then I'm also thinking, like, what's something, you can even have, like, drug-induced, because what if that person has Parkinson's disease? One of the big treatments for Parkinson's is a dopamine agonist. As you get older, you're more likely to have neurodegenerative disorders, so you'll be more likely to be on a dopamine agonist, right? Maybe when you're older than when you're younger. That can actually cause some schizophrenic-like symptoms if you're taking too much of that. Maybe they like grapefruit juice. If they're eating their grapefruit after they take their pills, they're getting a double dose of medication there. These are serious things to consider, right? So you really have to start looking at, pulling out the individual components that are unique. I think that becomes the issue. There are some blood tests you could possibly do if you wanted to look at like certain elevated neurotransmitter metabolites or something. We can talk a little bit about that later. That might help. But I don't know, with somebody in the elderly population, you're right, there are some interesting overlaps. There are overlaps in other categories as well. Younger folks who have schizophrenia, if their positive symptoms aren't very severe, they could often appear as though they're having other things like depression, because a lot of the negative symptoms are very similar to depression, right? You're going to have anhedonia, so you're going to have, you know, lack of ability to feel pleasure. You're going to be isolated. You're going to stay away from people. You're not going to, you know, be communicating with folks very well. I mean, these are not really things that are different than a sort of a depressive episode, right? So again, you have to try to look for those other symptoms as well to make sure you get the right diagnosis. Does that make sense? That was a good question. All right, thought disorder, definitely illogical thinking, no reasoning, can't recognize reality. One of the major problems with schizophrenia is there's so much variation, right? With Parkinson's disease, man, we know what's happening. You know, you're definitely having cells in your nigrostriatal pathway, they're dying, bingo. You've got some movement disorder, we can measure those things, we've got a scale, but I mean, schizophrenia, I mean, this is a tough one. The other thing, like I read this article a while back, brought this up at a Thanksgiving dinner last year, didn't go over well. It was about how do you know if somebody, the difference between like a psychosis and somebody who's religious. And I don't mean that in jest, I mean seriously, right? And especially when you're, so I think this is an important thing for you to think about, because And I'm going to be very careful here to not, like, you know, tip my hat one way or the other on this, Jason, to what I think. But when you're working in an area where there are sort of zealous factions, right, of religious groups, right, and these folks get very sort of animated and into things, then it becomes a real challenge, right? He's like, this guy thinks God's talking to him. Well, is that true, or does he need an antipsychotic? I don't know, right? I mean, so what do you do?
I thought you were supposed to ask, where's the voice coming from, outside of your body or from inside your body? Because if they say it's coming from outside of them,
Then they're okay?
then they're hallucinating.
Okay.
I don't get the difference.
Because if you're like thinking of something, like if you hear your voice thinking in your head, then it's not a hallucination, it's just
So
your
it's
thought
like a
voice.
thought disorder,
Yeah.
because God's telling me something.
But some people
Like
believe
there's- right?
that there can be like actual external things, right? Like, wasn't there a bush that talked?
Oh, fire, didn't it?
George?
No.
In the Bible.
Oh, I thought George Bush. Like, yeah, there was a bush
I
that
came
talked.
across a burning
I
bush.
saw that guy on TV.
Crazy.
You
I
know,
did.
yeah.
That was the burning
Didn't
bush.
follow fire.
Yeah. So it's
Oh,
like,
I thought you
I think that was a wildfire.
No.
Pretty easy
Like
explanation
really,
there.
a real burning bush.
But this is real
my
life.
point is, I feel like it is hard to differentiate.
That is the point.
Right,
It,
like-
and that was basically the article. He was a clinical
No, this is
psychologist
real
who
life.
wrote it.
This is the truth that that's never real.
Yeah. In real life, you're not going to hear a voice outside of yourself.
Except
And
for-
someone's
That's
not there.
Oh.
Because that doesn't happen.
Okay, you guys work out that. You're fine. I just assume everybody has a psychosis, and that makes my life easier.
Is there a part of the brain that's either, if it's damaged or if it's smaller, it's associated with higher religiosity? There's,
Yeah, Tia's does that.
yeah, that's one thing I do remember.
I don't remember.
It's one thing you do remember.
You got it.
Yeah,
But I don't remember what part of the brain it was, I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Was it something like
It's
here?
associated with higher
temporal?
religiosity, yeah, maybe.
Was it? is
The
it
parietal
this part?
lobes or the temporal lobe?
I can't remember if it was here or if it was like somewhere like, not the frontal part,
Yeah.
but like somewhere like in the middle,
Hmm.
close to that. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there was a guy who had some kind of like accident and then he became like super religious afterwards.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's
Oh,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, there you go. That
but I
happens.
don't remember what part, so that's not really helpful.
That happens to a lot of people after accidents, though, right? That's kind of hard to tell.
That's like an existential thing, though.
Yeah, I guess.
Like, you know.
There is this guy. Did I tell you guys about Dean Hamer? Have we not talked about the God gene in this class? Oh, so Dean Hamer wrote this book. You guys should read this, Sierra. It's a short book. It's only this long. Well, because most of the time when I say like read a book, right, Carmen? Not everybody, although you did, actually follows my suggestions. I appreciate that. So this book by Dean Hamer. So he's a geneticist, right? Look at Jason's already buying it on Amazon. It's a brilliant book for psychology students, I think. for a couple reasons. I mean, one, it's just interesting. So basically, this guy Dean Hamer, man, he's always in hot water, right? So he got in hot water the first time when he said, like, hey, I found the genes that make you gay, and so people didn't like that one, right? So that obviously didn't go over well. He's like, no, it's like right here, you get 2 of these, you're far more likely to identify as homosexual. So that's just kind of the way it works. Right? That was an easy one. Then he came up with this other thing. He said, hey, I found the genes that make you believe in God. And that made him even less popular. Nobody's liking this guy now. But basically, he did this study, and he just did it. You know, the DNA is easy, right? You get like 0, 1, or 2 copies of some allele, right? And you're like, okay, bingo. There's your 3 choices, right? 0, 1, or 2. Now, measuring whether or not someone's religious, that's a trick. It's like, how many times do you go to church a year? Well, that probably doesn't work. You know, some people have to go all the time because somebody else said so. And then some people never go, but they might be really religious, right? It doesn't really matter. So he spent, of this book that's only this long here, he spent this much of the book describing how he operationally defined being religious. Which is really, I think, what's important for psych students. Because you guys have to operationally define, like, really difficult things all the time, right? Like, so, like, just, you know, people just chatting, like, oh, I know what makes somebody religious, right? You know, so you can describe those things, but how do you actually measure that and compare across cultures and across religions, right? So Dean Hamer did a decent job of that. And then he's like, oh, if you get 2 copies of this allele, yep, you're going to be religious. If you don't get any, not at all. There you go. It's a done deal. So, which is kind of interesting, I find.
So, so what's his thought about, like, people that change? Like an epigenetic type deal, yeah? Or something?
You know, at the time he wrote this book, which was probably a decade or so ago, epigenetics wasn't as like mainstream as it is now. So I don't think that he actually considered that as much. He may have since then. I haven't really followed up on his work too much. So, all right, that was interesting and cool. I'll read something else. And that is a possibility. Epigenetic factors are obviously, it's a lot bigger deal than we think it is. And who knows what's going to happen. So there you go. It's kind of interesting. So Jason, have you bought the book yet?
No, I was actually looking at that part of the brain that I was talking about.
Oh.
It's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Oh.
That area.
That's a good one. It is. Yeah, so dorsal, where's the dorsal part? That's like a dorsal fin. Lateral, it's kind of out prefrontal. So there you go. That's where that's located. All right, so there you go. Schizophrenia hallucinations are common auditory hallucinations, not typically visual hallucinations, right? It's mostly auditory stuff. Hear a lot of voices, apparently are insulting or demanding.
If people are having like other types of hallucinations, like if they're smelling things that aren't there or feeling things that aren't there, do you see that more with schizophrenia that starts earlier or that's more severe?
Yeah, so yes and yes. The more severe your symptom, you know, to move past auditory hallucinations, things are going to be more severe. Typically, to get to that point, you have to have an earlier onset of schizophrenia. The earlier you start exhibiting symptoms, and some people even exhibit symptoms as children, as young children, right? So that is a possibility. It's not like just wait until you're 15 or 16 and see what happens. Some kids, you know, 8 or 9 years old, may start exhibiting some symptoms, which can also be tricky, right? Because, you know, like, oh, you know, kids with imaginary friend, right? And so you have that problem. So there you go. But yeah, so you need to start, the earlier you start exhibiting symptoms, the more severe things will be. And that's, you know, that's a pretty common situation. There are reasons for that, if you want to think about it. So what are the things that might cause you to have schizophrenia? Well, there are multiple hypotheses. We'll talk about some of those. Some of them are related to like genetic predisposition, which genetics clearly plays a role. So obviously if you're more genetically inclined, you know, you're going to have more severe symptoms. There are some environmental issues, right? And so obviously if you're hitting all of the environmental issues, things are going to be worse. So that's going to put you in those sort of categories, right? And environmental can include, you know, the prenatal environment as well, right? So there are all these like neuroinflammatory sort of concerns with you know, and its effects on development, right? And so there are some other genetic issues with like movement and migration of brain cells during early development phases. How many of you are familiar with what is it called? It's like the Scandinavian famine study or something. That's the word I'm looking for. Does that not sound right? Type that into the old Google. See what comes up.
Scandinavian.
Famine study. I think that's what it's called. Was that a thing? That wasn't a thing.
Not on EBSCOs.
Oh. Kristen's almost got something.
1836 famine altered the genes of children born decades later in Scandinavia.
Sounds like something.
Yeah.
There were some vitamin deficiencies. What they've also noted is, not just there, but in other places, when children are born to sort of malnourished and impoverished situations, they're more likely to develop, them and their offspring, more likely to develop psychosis than natural, or than the, you know, like a natural population, right? And some of that's related to, again, developmental issues. So there are developmental issues that can cause the onset of schizophrenia. And if you're in a situation where you're not, you know, getting all the nutrients that you need, you know, if you're having some inflammatory issues, even like things that we typically think about, like with the immune system, interleukins and other things that can get started in that prenatal environment and cause you some problems.
What are the Scandinavian countries?
Huh?
Like Sweden, okay.
Yeah, those really cold northern countries that people still live in.
I was just curious if
The
it's the
three.
same ones.
The three.
Cause I don't geography very well.
Fingers.
That's where the Vikings are from.
I'd love to tell you Viking is a verb and not a noun, but that's okay. We'll let that go. So, illusions. Here's another one all the time, like people think that their thoughts are being broadcast out to the world, right? Do they wear, in all seriousness, do they take, I know we always joke about like tinfoil hats, but do they take like precautions to prevent that? Because they often will.
No, because they also have a little touch of narcissism, so they want people to know their thoughts.
Oh, that seems reasonable.
That's how mine is.
They
They can't go to the grocery store because people know.
Really?
Mine told me that like all the other inmates were told by the government to like not tell him when the reader is on his back. So he also told me that there's laser tubes from the satellites that are now tracking what I say, and I'm microchipped because of meeting with him. So
Damn, he's really important.
oh yeah, he's legit.
Those
And his
laser tubes.
Yeah, laser tubes. That's what they are. I was like, okay, that's a fun time. And he also said that his last therapist, because she didn't diagnose him with schizophrenia, they broke her leg. So
So you know what your diagnosis is?
Yeah.
You're definitely schizophrenic. I'm not taking a chance.
I'm like, watch, I go into work sometime and my leg's broken. He's gonna be like, they got you. I'm all freaked out.
I wonder what like long-term effects technology will have, because like now you're not
Oh.
paranoid if you think people are watching you because they are.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
He said there's telepathic computers, so they read his thoughts all the time.
Wow.
Mhm.
That might be a stretch.
Yeah.
They kind of do though. Like it's an algorithm.
Sometimes
Like,
like
I'm-
something, and there it is on Facebook as
Right.
an ad.
Like he doesn't have.
Well, your microphone's listening to you, so.
It's just like those Mark Zuckerberg.
Why is your
weirdos.
picture covered right now?
Right, but they probably do algorithms that associate. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, but
if I Google like a hiking trail, then all of a sudden like
Uh-huh.
you know Patagonia's ads are up. or
About
what- You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. That's going to be interesting. You guys should watch
Yeah,
out.
to
Yeah.
a point.
Yeah.
Like mine was
Report
on
back
my
to me in
phone.
10 years when we
Like,
have
on my
telepathic
computer because
computers.
someone would be watching me and
And
again.
see what
Log
happens.
on.
That's good.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's like Christmas.
They're all gonna be.
Yeah,
which
that's what
one?
my client does. When they think someone's watching them through their computer.
They are.
I know, that's why it's hard to discount.
That is true. Right. I mean, you should put.
Yeah, you gotta cover your camera.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they do
My
other
thing
things.
is, who cares though? Right? Like, do you really, at the end of the day, care?
If
that,
you
like,
have
they
thoughts
see your
that the
double
government
chin,
wants.
like, while you watch Netflix?
Well, if you
I
get
don't-
naked
But
and
perverts,
forget.
yeah, there are perverts out there. You gotta watch out for that.
Yeah, but whatever. That's
Oh.
what
I don't want
Makes
to
your
be
life
naked
happy.
for people. I don't know, I read
But I'll be
1984.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
comment on that, but I read that one as well.
I don't want to be naked if in front of somebody if they know it. If I know
Red
that, but like
1984.
ignorance is, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, if it happens, it happens.
Yeah, but then they're
Yeah.
gonna throw you in the
All right,
camps and
great
get
job,
rats
folks.
eaten face.
Um,
I just-
Destiny, and now on to something completely different. That was just for you.
Thanks.
I enjoy those.
You have the illogical communication, right? Not a big deal. They have vague or repetitive speech, shift from one subject to another, right? From time to time. I don't know, sometimes just realize that might be describing someone who may or may not be schizophrenic, right? I mean, do you ever think about that? Like, oh, wait a minute. I see someone like that all the time. Emotions may be absent or totally inappropriate to the situation, right? So you got that going too. Way to go. Crazy laughter.
Flat.
Flat affect actually is a big one, right? So that flat affect is kind of, whatever. I'm in prison, I don't care.
He was a laugher.
He was a laugher.
He thought it was all very. Oh, he was creepy, but it was amusing. I just listened the whole time.
Well, there you go.
These are creeps.
Yeah, what are you going to do? I mean, I don't know. Also, they have bad hygiene, right? That's something. Because they'll often, they won't have interest in those activities anymore, right? And so they'll kind of stop. I mean, it's going to sound weird, but you all get a little bit of pleasure out of cleaning yourselves.
Like a cat.
I told you it was going to sound weird, but it's okay. That's weird. I just
I'm
meant,
not the only person.
like in general,
Like cleaning your ears.
Cleaning your ears.
keeping yourself clean is a rewarding activity, right? And it activates some dopamine. Where, Jessica?
And then
Yes.
nucleus accumbens. I'm
There
just
you
not
go.
even going to try the acronym.
There you go. And so that's
No, I'm kidding.
not happening for these folks as much. They'll also have some cognitive issues. Obviously with all these other things going on, you have some cognitive deficits. Definitely going to make it difficult for you to like hold down a job or go to school, right? I'm sure you guys have probably all seen situations. I don't know. You guys work in the clinic?
I did last year.
You did last year. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure kids come in there and they have like the onset of schizophrenic symptoms, and then you think, wow, man, how's this guy going to finish like his degree, right? And then stuff. Lots of motor activity is going to be reduced. On top of that, what motor activity they do have is going to be kind of weird, right? They'll often like jump into bizarre postures, right? Like weird situations. They also have some stereotyped moving, right? Rocking, pacing, things like that. Now that's pretty typical for a lot of other disorders as well, right? I mean, rocking and pacing is not really something that's like, my guy's rocking, I bet he's schizophrenic. Well, he could be like 12 other things too. Or instead of that. So there you go.
It makes it really hard though when you think about early onset of schizophrenia and like potential autism across.
Absolutely, Corey. And that really is, because one of the things you look for in autism is rocking and pacing and those repetitive behaviors. And if somebody's like, 6 or 8 years old and they're doing that, and you may not be thinking schizophrenia at that time, you might be thinking something else, right? Autism being that can really muddy the waters a bit for you. You're absolutely right. It's kind of interesting. That was a good point. And you got to watch out for agitation and violence, right? There you go. Again, no two people are going to have the exact same thing going on. Symptoms can vary from time to time, right? So you can have some variability in that. Folks may seem to be doing okay for a little while, and then they're not, and they go back to doing okay, right? And those 3 different symptoms may become more or less prominent over time as well, right? So right now, might be dealing with more of the positive symptoms. Later, they can be dealing with more of the negative. It varies over time. All right, so we talked about positive symptoms. What were those? Delusions, hallucinations, bizarre behavior. Most of the folks with a lot of positive symptoms, you give them a typical antipsychotic. It's going to block their dopamine receptors, those D2 receptors. It's going to take care of those, right? For the most part. Negative symptoms, we already said reduced speech, flat affect, social withdrawal, no motivation. Again, if negative symptoms are going to be the primary sort of complaint, Carmen, you might confuse that with depression, right? Because they do look very similar. You've got your cognitive issues, your working memory sort of goes out the window, executive function, you have trouble with attention. Again, these in and of themselves are not right. I mean, these can be other things, right? I mean, how many other things in the DSM say you've got impaired working memory? It's like all of them, right? So you've got to kind of look at this cluster of symptoms, right? Try to figure out what's going on. The problem is currently the negative and the cognitive symptoms are not really responsive to antipsychotic drugs, right? You can give folks, your typical antipsychotics. They might stop hearing voices. They might stop thinking that they're, I don't know, going to save the planet or something, right? But they're still probably going to have those, social withdrawal, the flat affect, and some of the other issues, right? Now there is some work to work on the cognitive symptoms, right? So we've talked a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. We've talked a little bit about like acetylcholine. So there are some, sometimes they will give folks like 2 drugs. So give you something to work on the dopamine and something to kind of boost your acetylcholine a little bit, right? So you can kind of try to boost that cognitive performance a little bit. On top of what makes some of this worse, some of your antipsychotics actually have anticholinergic effects as well. I know, right, Olivia? So not only are we not fixing the problem with the cognitive symptoms, we might even be making it just a little bit worse. But the point there is to try to keep you from, doing the things, acting out the things that might be the result of the positive symptoms, right? So you kind of...
What would be the harm in treating them? Well, you don't want to up their dopamine because they already have too much of that. But what would be the harm in treating the negative symptoms like depression?
Yeah, no, there's the only thing you'd really have to worry about is like drug interactions if there were any. But yeah, you should probably...
Is that common though, to
Work on
like
that
give
as
them
well.
an antipsychotic and something to treat like their negative symptoms?
I mean, they usually don't, because they're not...
Because that's not the...
Because they're not depression, right? Treating them like depression may or may not be effective. I mean, obviously there could be some comorbidity, it may work. There you go. Let's see. What do we know about ventricles? Folks with schizophrenia have larger ventricles. So they actually seem to have like some reduced cerebral volume. It's not because they have fewer brain cells, so their brain cells aren't dying, right? So they don't have a reduction in the number of brain cells. But the brain cells are actually smaller, right? So the cell bodies are smaller. Their dendrites are smaller. They have fewer spines, right? So this is where we have those contact points, right? So they have a lower spine density, which is actually kind of interesting. And their cells are packed in there tighter, right? So everything's like packed in tight in this like small space, and they're losing some of that rich connection. Which is kind of interesting, right? You start to think about this. You start to think about someone being, and there's a kind of a great example. These are actually identical twins. And this should tell you a couple things on this one slide. One, you obviously see the enlarged ventricles in the individual who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Here's the individual who wasn't. So one, that gives me a great brain sort of region I could look at to see, like, hey, what's going on there. The second thing this should tell you is, well, it's not 100% genetic, right? Because these are identical twins. One was diagnosed and one wasn't. So if it was 100% genetic, then they would both have schizophrenia, right? So it doesn't seem to be the case.
Since they're hearing voices, is there like activity in Broca's area or Lund's area?
That's interesting. Jessica, how easy do you think it would be to get your guy into an fMRI machine?
I don't think that's gonna happen.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Not while he's awake.
Not while he's
Oh
awake.
yeah, hooking him. Oh my God, he would go crazy with that.
Yeah, so I think largely we don't know. Because, again, if you think people are trying to listen to your thoughts, you're not crawling in an fMRI machine, right? You're not getting it. Like, no way. No way am I getting in there, right? A lot of you won't get in one anyway, and you don't have schizophrenia, right? Correct. Correct. Well, we've identified who you are now. So I think actually, monitoring brain activity in these individuals while they're doing it is kind of tricky, right? So I don't know if there's
Google
any.
says yes.
Google says yes.
Increased blood flow
Huh.
in Broca's area during auditory hallucinations and
That's what I was gonna say, I thought I'd heard that before, that like,
That's interesting.
the activity is there, so it's,
So stuff's happening.
right, whether.
I mean, stuff has to happen. I mean, I didn't know if it was there. It could be up in like frontal cortex or something else.
It's cool, it shows that difference between like, the stimulus and the perception.
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Absolutely, because there's no stimulus.
right, but
There's no
that's,
stimulus with the hallucination at all. I mean, you can induce hallucinations in folks, right? Just by like zapping their cortex. Sounds like fun, right?
you can perceive without seeing.
Certainly. That's exactly. I mean, that's exactly what schizophrenia. I mean, at least those symptoms. I mean, any hallucination. And most of you've hallucinated at some point, right? Nobody. Some people are like, I don't know if I want to nod.
What are you referring to? In delirium?
Delirium? That might be a little different.
When you're falling asleep, you're like susceptible.
Like,
Yeah,
really
you
late
you
night
can.
driving.
Talking about like
Or
shadow
sleep
paralysis,
Yeah,
yeah,
they
that shit happens to me.
That happens.
Not shadow people,
Not a big
shadow
deal.
people.
So we've already talked about dendritic trees, connectivity failures. Here's a nice picture. This is somebody with schizophrenia, this is somebody without schizophrenia. Look at that nice sort of weird arrays. Look at how, those are beautiful, right? Those cell bodies, those are cell bodies. Those are pyramidal cells in the cortex. See how they're shaped like pyramids, how they're kind of like triangular shaped? You guys don't see that? Okay, somebody does. So you can see on this side, you know, they're fairly well organized. If you look over here, I mean, stuff's just kind of jumbled, right? And you can tell a big difference. Look at the way all the cell bodies are lined up, kind of pointing in the same directions. Here, they're just every which way, right? And part of this is, oh, it's actually in the hippocampus. I thought it was cortex. But you'd see the same thing in other places as well, including cortex. So part of the problem here with these folks with schizophrenia is they have some genetic issues, right? And some of the genes that are screwed up are genes that are responsible for the migration of these brain cells during development, right? So, you know, when you're, you know, just like a whole 4 cells, right? And then you start like duplicating and duplicating, you keep doing that, right? And you're like a fetus and whatever, right? Then you start like developing brain tissue, neural tissue, right? And it has to move from one place to another so you can get that nice sort of elongated tube, right? Which is really just your central nervous system. You gotta get all those brain wrinkles, right? And you've gotta put certain neurons in certain places. You gotta move those things around, right? And there are a ton of genes that are responsible for that. If those cells don't make it to the right places, you can have developmental disorders, right? Which is exactly what happens. And so thinking about schizophrenia in that regard, we know that the genes that are responsible for the migration of these cells are absent or faulty in individuals with schizophrenia, and then we can see the evidence of that here, right? In this postmortem brain tissue, we can see that they're, in this case, the hippocampus is poorly organized compared to a healthy control. And that's, again, not surprising, given that the genes that are responsible for this are screwed up. Which might be, Jason, why there's not a cure, right? If the problem is your brain cells are not organized properly, how do you fix that? Well, you reorganize your brain cells. That doesn't seem like something we're going to be able to do anytime soon, right? So I think what you're left with something like schizophrenia is treatment options, right? If it truly is a brain organization issue, there's nothing you can do about that. There are preventative things you can do, right? So I think one of the things is like a thing I always recommend is don't have kids. That's one of the best ways to prevent schizophrenia because there just aren't going to be people born to have disorders. So that works. The other thing is if you're going to have kids, like actually do things to take care of your body like a year ahead of time, right? So that requires some planning. I understand that, right? But I think if we had better like prenatal education programs and, right, Cassie, because
Yeah, with sexuality, that's
I mean,
thing.
the problem
People are
is
not educated about what you're supposed to do or what you should do.
no, and I mean it wasn't such a big deal when things killed us quicker. The problem is now people live so long, they're around that long, and they're causing problems for themselves and other people, right? Back when everybody died when they were 35, like, who cares? You're schizophrenic for 5 years, you're not going to cause any problems, you know? I mean, then you're dead. It's not a big deal. But now, where people live so long, I think you got to work as hard as you can, as early as you can, to make sure that your offspring have the best opportunity possible to be successful. And I don't mean successful like they've got to get like a doctorate, but just to like be a healthy, normal person who can interact in society, right? That's what I mean by being successful. So, because I mean, it's a real crapshoot what happens anyway. You just roll that genetic dice, you don't know what comes out, right? But if you're taking active steps to make that worse, that's no good, right? You got to get as many roll bonuses as you can.
Father age is like a thing. They talked about that in undergrad, but it was like a newer thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's still sort of relatively new. There are the age of the father seems to be more important in a lot of aspects now, and that's largely going to be sort of epigenetic issues, right? And I think that's sort of an interesting theme. So, I don't know, I guess the moral of the story is it's okay to marry an old dude, but if you're going to get pregnant, have a young guy on the side.
Sperm donor.
It's actually really depressing.
That's really depressing.
That's a good quote.
Why is that depressing?
Yeah. Hide your period.
Hide your period.
Have
I'm just telling you all kinds of great things to do with your life, right?
Do LSD.
Do LSD.
If you're gonna do one.
You're going to do a drug, yeah. So I think age of the father, I don't think we're actually... All right, so here's like the second problem with schizophrenia that we haven't really talked about, right? What's awesome about high blood pressure? Carmen, I can give a rat high blood pressure. That's what's awesome about that, right? And I can give it high blood pressure in the same way that you get high blood pressure, right? By eating McDonald's, right? I can feed a rat Big Macs, and it's going to get high blood pressure. It's going to get blockage in its blood vessels. I can feed it whatever, and I can give it diabetes. I can do these things, right? I cannot give a rat schizophrenia, right? Why? Well, how do I know if a rat's schizophrenic? I don't, right? I mean, the point of that is there are a ton of models of schizophrenia that we use in animals that we study, but it's often we're studying one kind of set of symptoms, right? So one thing they'll do, Corey, is they'll give them like amphetamines, right? And so they'll induce some of the motor aspects of schizophrenia by giving rats amphetamines, right? But that doesn't necessarily, does that mean there's like the rat thinks some rat god is telling it to like save the rat world? I don't know, right? And I'm not going to know. Like, what is a delusion for a rat? Like, seriously, right, Carmen? You have no idea. I have no idea, right? How do I know if a rat, I mean, I could figure out if a rat was experiencing anhedonia, right? Because I wouldn't be able to train it to press a lever for a treat.
You're the rat god. Yeah. Come in and pluck them out. They haven't had a body experience.
I guess, right? That's kind of interesting.
Come out of the mosquito.
I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that's interesting. Especially back when I was giving them LSD. That was something.
They probably were having a god experience.
Yeah.
Like, I saw God's face, I swear.
That's terrifying.
It's the laboratory.
The point is, with schizophrenia, with it being such a complicated disorder, it's hard to make animal models, right? And so we do what we can with animal models, but there's not an animal model where we're getting like old rats and hooking them up with young female rats and like seeing it, right? I mean,
But you could do that.
you could, but the thing is rats don't really develop schizophrenia. I mean, they don't naturally develop schizophrenia, right? So we have to induce it through these other approaches, and so I don't know that that would be great. So then your next option is to get a bunch of old dudes to try to have babies with young women, right? And see if their kids have schizophrenia or not. But nobody's really signing up for that study either, right?
So what does that say about like human schizophrenia if you can't give it to a rat?
Well, there's already a group of people who do that, though. You could
Sugar
ask them to be
babies.
in your study.
I could, but I just don't know that
Who are you burying in hell with the checkoff box?
Yeah. Got a baby
Yeah, so
girl,
Jessica,
but-
that's a good, what was your question again?
So like, if we can't, like, if schizophrenia isn't naturally occurring or whatever in rats,
Yeah.
what does that say about it in humans? Like, are they all just faking it? Like,
No, we have different DNA, we have different brain structures. We're evolved to do different things, and some of that is, different kinds of social interactions, higher order planning. If you think about what's a thought disorder in a rat,
oh, that's good.
I don't know, right? I mean, so if a rat's like,
Could happen.
I'm gonna go get some food, or that's really a rat's thought process, right? I need food, I'm hungry. There's not a lot of frontal cortex in a rat. There's a lot of frontal cortex in humans, right? I guess we could probably give a monkey schizophrenia. That sounds like that's a bad idea.
You're really funny.
Some people are still teaching the refrigerator mother thing. Did you know that?
What's
that?
Some people are idiots. Did
Don't
you
you
know that?
remember the refrigerator mother is like that your mom is
They
cold
are.
resistant and
Sorry.
it makes you schizophrenic?
Were you teaching that?
No.
Good.
I knew they used to say that for
I feel like
autism.
that
I didn't know that
Oh,
was
I
for
don't-
schizophrenia.
It was for
I've heard-
autism primarily.
I've heard it for schizophrenia too.
I've never heard that.
But yeah, some people are still teaching that.
It probably is your mother's fault,
I
though,
would be.
if you have schizophrenia. I mean, she's responsible for half your DNA, right, Jason?
Autism.
And she's responsible for that prenatal environment.
It's all your mom's.
And if that screws you up, then it's her fault.
So
You're not quite ready to pull that trigger blame, are you? I am. I'll blame my mom all day for
Be
stuff.
cold and distant. Let's just try it.
I have a question about the disorganization.
Yeah.
Like, so if latent onset,
Yeah.
like, and they were normal up to that point, like, how, you know what I mean? You follow
Yeah,
me?
no, I know what you mean, right? Why weren't they screwed up from the beginning? If their brain was screwed up, why weren't they screwed up? That's a great question. I don't know that we know the answer. I think, if I'm just speculating, I would think it's due to the fact that you're still doing a ton of brain development up into your early teens, right? And so things are still moving and fleshing out, right? And so you're still sort of refining these pathways. And it might be, if you were to look at someone's brain who's like younger, it might look more like this in general because of synaptic pruning hasn't happened completely yet. You're still going through some of that process. Now, once you've completed that process and you're still left with this mess, that's when you might have problems. But we all have connectivity issues from birth up for a number of years, right? As we're sort of like getting rid of those connections that we don't need anymore. So that could be why, while that developmental process is still happening,
What about with the women with the onset in the late 30s, early 40s?
well, there's sort of a, what they call like a two-hit hypothesis, right? So it's not just you need this sort of, like genetic organizational issue, but later you have to have some environmental impact as well, right? And so for women who have their kind of late onset, the reduction of estrogen could be that second sort of issue, right? And so it's the same thing maybe with other folks, because also again, you're going back to these identical twins, right? I mean, these guys theoretically have similar brain organization, right? I mean, if we were to look at their brains, and the hippocampus, they may both look like this, right? They may not. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell. But something may have happened early during development that triggered one process to end up more like this, and the other to continue down that healthy pathway, even though they both kind of had that baseline predisposition. If there's some sort of genetic issue, not genetic issue, but non-genetic issue. A lot of folks think it's related again to inflammation, right? So if there are sort of inflammatory events that happen that can influence that development, that can be a problem, like early during development. So don't get sick while you're pregnant. Don't let your kids get sick. Work on that.
Like the one inside you?
What?
The ones
said-
outside you.
Oh, okay. It's like, wait, how does that happen?
Yeah. Let's see, what else can I think of? The second problem is a lot of these brain imaging studies have been done in individuals who have been on antipsychotics or other things for an extended period of time, right? And so sometimes it's hard to tell, did the atrophy occur because of the disorder or because of the treatment for the disorder? And often it's hard to tease that out.
When one of the first antipsychotics didn't it cause shrinkage of, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, well, there you go, right? So even the newer ones, I mean, that's the thing we don't know, right? I mean, it's, and they cause so many side effects. Like, antipsychotics are dangerous business, folks. I mean, so many people who are on antipsychotics for an extended period of time are going to develop severe side effects. Severe side effects. I mean, we're talking like Parkinsonism and tardive dyskinesia are horrible, right? And folks who are on antipsychotics for an extended period of time are going to develop those problems. It's going to happen. And other problems, right? Other problems can happen. Side effects. I don't know, you think you're going to solve a problem and you just make it worse. Or solve part of a problem, right? But I think that's the thing to think about with schizophrenia is it's really like three problems, right? It's the positive, the negative, and the cognitive, right? And there are three different sets of brain circuits, three different neurotransmitters might be, sets of neurotransmitters might be involved, three different sort of issues, and if you're treating just one of those, you're probably not going to get the full.
I thought that typically you had predominantly, I don't know a lot about it, isn't it predominantly positive or predominantly negative, or do people tend to have a mix? I thought it was kind of, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
But-
I don't know. I thought it was
Understand
more
your
one or the
question.
other.
yeah, it is, and that can shift from time to
Okay.
time. But you still should, I mean, we still ideally should treat all, right? Because, as Jessica said, once you get rid of the delusions, you're still left with those other symptoms. You get rid of some of those other symptoms, you may still hear voices, you may still have working memory problems, or some other things going on.
Why would someone, so I have several people that have been diagnosed with bipolar, but they're on antipsychotics. Why would they be prescribed that for that?
That's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
You know what antipsychotics they're on? Because the antipsychotics, there are some that are like specifically like dopamine, and then there are some that are like broad acting that have effects at other neurotransmitters as well. And that's why lithium affects a number of neurotransmitters. If they're giving them like a broad acting antipsychotic, that might be some of what they're thinking about. Depends on some of the other problems they're having as well. An antipsychotic might be a choice. They may not have tolerated the lithium well. I mean, I kind of find that hard to believe, but there could be other reasons that they don't want them to take that, or that didn't work. So, anybody ever done the Wisconsin card sorting task? Yeah, how fun is that?
It makes people really mad.
Yeah. Folks who are schizophrenic aren't so good at this. They have, Jason, hypofrontality, right? Which means their frontal cortex is not working so well. And so they have trouble switching rules. So for those of you that don't know the Wisconsin card sorting task, it's kind of fun. You have to be in Wisconsin to do it. Basically, they give you, it's weird, they give you a deck of cards and they say, hey, match this up to these categories, right? And they give you like, here you can see it's like 3 blue circles, 2 green triangles, a red star, and then 4 yellow plus signs. And so then they give you like 1 green plus sign. You're like, well, what category does that go in? I don't know. Right? It could go in either shape, number, or color, right? And so those are kind of the things you can do. So they said, hey, it's going to be color. And they go like, oh, right or wrong. And then if it's right, you go like, okay, so I'm just going to match colors, right? And so you start matching colors. Then all of a sudden, they go, nah, we changed the rule. That doesn't work anymore. And people are like, well, that's weird. And then they'll often, they'll repeat it, right? Or repeat the same wrong one. And then they might try to start other categories, right? So they'll like, okay, so maybe they're switching it up to number, right? And so most folks are fairly good at that. There'll be a few errors. Now the second time through, because you have to do this a couple times, right? The second time through, it's like, it changed. I'll go, oh, you got me last time. Now the rule changes, and I know it, right? So when the rule changes, you can make that adjustment. Folks with schizophrenia don't make that shift very well, right? They're not so great at that kind of rule change business, right? That's kind of interesting. Hey, Jason, once I had these rats, and I went, and I killed their prefrontal cortex, and then I put them in this box where they had to pick like a lever for a reward. And they did that quite well, up until the point I switched the rule on them. And then they had to pick the other lever to get a reward. They didn't do that very well. And again, I lesioned their prefrontal cortex.
Did they do it well? Did the controls do it well?
Yeah, the controls were pretty good at it.
Really?
You know, they'll press the lever a few times, like no reward, and then they'll like try this other lever. And so then they'll switch over. Huh?
So rats are smarter than people.
Yeah, rats are.
He's rat over his nose.
Yeah.
He's rat.
Rats are really like, there's not a lot of behavioral variability, so it's like, oh, I can press this lever and get a reward. What else can I do? Well, I can press that lever and get a reward. So I'll try that, you know. Yeah, so the controls would rule switch fairly well, but the others would not.
How do you lesion their frontal cortex?
All right, so you want a real detailed story?
Actually, yeah.
Okay. So the first
Like,
thing
do
you do
you chop their thing and then flap it back?
Well, that's not exactly how you do it, but that's close. So first you should anesthetize the rat.
Well, yeah.
And then you have to put in a thing called a stereotaxic device, which holds its like teeth and its ears. So it does it like if you're trying to like,
Yeah.
you can't do that, right? So, and you've got this like arm that comes out, and you find the coordinates, and you can go down. You can like, you know, inject things, right? So the first thing you do is you cut down the middle, and then you kind of part the scalp, and you got to clean that off because there's gonna be.
I was right with it.
Yeah, I mean we don't like, you know, circle it,
Yeah.
flip it up, but yeah, you were right so far. Then you have to drill a hole in the skull, right? So you can drill like a small hole, and then what you do is you take like a glass pipette, right? So it's like a glass tube that's super small. You stick it in the brain, and then you squirt out. So what I used was like a glutamate agonist, right? So if you squirt out a chemical that's excitotoxic, all the cells go and then they'll die. And then you can pull out the pipette. You usually put like, there's like stuff called gel foam you cram down in that hole. Maybe you put a little bone wax over the top of it, right? So it's like not like a hole. You sew up the scalp and you call it a done deal.
How do you drill the hole? Do they have like little baby screws?
So you can use like a Dremel. Basically, they make these little, I mean, Dremels aren't the best always, but they make tools that you can drill holes. And then what you would do is you use like either a burr, so like at the end it'll have like a ball with these kind of like sharp edges, or you use a thing called a trephine, which is what they'll use if they drill a hole in your head. It's like a hole saw, right? If you've ever drilled like for a doorknob, right? You've seen like the hole saws, it's like that, but super small. And then you're done.
And that's all you can do with that particular rat then? Like, he's done.
Yeah, I mean, you put him through the study, and then obviously you're gonna have to confirm that you lesioned the correct brain region. So you're gonna have to later euthanize and remove the brain, process that, analyze the data. Go from
You
there.
get like a nice retirement for like being a good sport through the whole thing before you.
Throw him some LSD for a party.
Okay.
No, that's gonna screw up your brain.
Okay.
Who told you could take LSD and you'd be fine? You don't want to do anything that's going to confound it. And so what you'll do is, like I said, you euthanize it. You actually sort of embalm it because you want the brain is normally like really squishy, kind of like chewing gum. I think it's like juicy fruit, you know, like chewed up juicy fruit. It's kind of squishy. So you want to make it hard and firm, or firm enough so you can slice it, so that you can actually like expose it to different chemicals, so you can see some contrast, like they did here. So you can actually see the different brain cells. That's pretty exciting, right?
So you go like hell the brain?
With gloves. Because you basically filled their bodies with formaldehyde as a fixative. So you want to wear gloves and a mask.
Are they dead at that point?
Once you take their brain out or fill their bodies with
Okay.
formaldehyde?
I thought you were just filling live rats with formaldehyde.
You missed
No,
the
you said euthanize
euthanasia
them.
step.
I got stuck on juicy fruit, I'm sorry.
So that's how that works. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It is kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
I wouldn't say fun, that's a little dextery, but like.
God, he's a devil. It's not a merciful God.
So there you go. Any other questions, Jessica? That was a
No.
good one.
I like
It was a good methodological question, actually. Let's see.
flap open the scalp.
All right, we got to get moving because you guys, we've talked about this, maternal risk. Oh, microglia get involved, right? So that's kind of interesting. You would think that microglia would be up. These are the guys that are involved in the brain immune system kind of thing. They're not really, they may or may not be. It's kind of, inconsistent. But when you have these cytokines, produces that inflammatory response, can really cause some problems on that developing brain. So your synapses get all screwed up and they're not well organized. Hey, they were describing schizophrenia as early as 1000 BC. This guy also thought laser tubes. You ever think about that?
That's interesting.
Like, what were they like? What were they like in 1000 BC? What were they?
What were their delusions?
Who was out to get them? Everyone.
Right, like all 8 of those people who exist in the world at that time were out to get. And like,
Probably still aliens.
what were they broadcast? I mean, how did?
One delusion that I know of that's associated commonly with schizophrenia in younger teens is that their parents have been replaced by somebody else, like they're not really their parents.
Oh yeah.
So
that would still work.
that would still work.
That would work. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a name.
That's a term.
That's a term.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't
It's
remember.
not gonna be on a test for
You
this
believe
class.
multiple people have been replaced by, like
doppelgangers.
Yeah.
Really?
That's a thing right now.
Like, people are on that. Gotta Google it.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, like people coming out of prison and then they've been cloned and stuff. It's like it's a
I saw that movie. What was that movie? It was Scarlett Johansson and Ewan McGregor. Yeah, you remember that movie, of course. Did you like that movie?
Capgras.
Capgras. Oh,
People are saying
there you go. You guys can get that one. We already talked about, like, here's your sort of genetic sort of breakdown, right? Here's what's the weird thing, like only 1%, like how much do we know about schizophrenia, right? Like how much do people get worked up about this? Only 1% of the population has schizophrenia, right? Only 1% of the population. That's it. That's it. I'm not making light of that. I mean, that's a significant number of people, right? But it's 1%. But here you go, you can kind of see, if you have like 2 parents that are schizophrenic, woohoo, you've got like a 50% shot. That's something, right?
Seriously. Oh, that's sad. You say psych ward babies?
I said pass out condoms in the psych ward.
Oh,
Yeah.
Seriously.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't spend a lot of time
In the
psych
nursing
wards.
homes.
yeah, the
I
old
like
boys.
that.
Let
Nursing
them
homes
fuck.
can't have babies.
No, but they can have other things.
Well,
Yes,
they're
TVs.
on their way out.
They make antibiotics.
Yeah, they're on their way out. Let them do it.
Not for all of them.
Yeah, let them live.
That's what I'm gonna do when I'm like 80. I'm just gonna like stop wearing gloves in the lab. I'm like, whatever, something's gonna kill me.
That's
Drink a little
code.
formaldehyde.
You telling everyone about safe sex.
Nursing homes?
Like, yeah,
Well,
the
it
casting
is.
is in the nursing home telling
You
everyone
have
about
to,
safe
right?
sex.
You have to tell old people about safe sex.
Yeah.
They've forgotten about it.
Like that episode of Parks and
in
Rec.
nursing homes in an older population.
That's
They're
what I'm
not-
saying.
They're not using safe practices. and
Right.
They're getting the clap and like crotch critters and all sorts of awful things. I did, yes.
It happens.
That's what it is.
Well, they forget to, I mean, when you're old, you forget things. But you know how some stuff still works, so,
Plus, sex wasn't as big of a thing.
yeah.
This is true.
That's why you need to ask, like, how many of your parents are baby boomers? They're probably right on the edge, right?
My grandparents.
When's that time period?
It ends in like 65?
Oh, hell no.
Oh.
Then what? Then yes or no?
Yeah, my dad was 66. No, 63.
Yeah.
I thought that was not baby boomers.
No, that's still technically the baby boomers, right?
Sherry was sweet.
I think so. That's why it's such a big deal to get baby boomers, like, checked for hepatitis, right? I made my parents get checked.
My dad's a baby boomer.
I did. I was like, you guys gotta go.
Christmas present.
I was like, you gotta go. And they were like, all right. we'll go. I mean, here's the thing, right? Like the other thing, like how many of your parents probably live a more conservative lifestyle now than they did 30 years ago?
Yeah.
Like some of them, right? Some of them.
Well,
In general, that happens,
not
right?
fucking everybody.
In general, when you're younger, you do some things you don't when you're older. And so a lot of those people will A, forget what they've done when they were younger, or B, don't want to admit to it, especially to like their kids, right? Like, oh, there's no reason I should be tested. I've never used a needle. Yeah, you know, look, I saw the wedding photos. I think you guys need to get checked for hepatitis.
Is that how that conversation went for you?
That's adorable.
They just went, I mean, my dad got married in a plaid suit. And
Oh, yeah.
You sat down with him, so I
yeah. And if you get married in a plaid suit and his hair was like down to here and he has this big beard, it's like,
free love.
you gotta go
Free
get
love.
checked. You know, you guys just, because I don't want to deal with it. And they're like, all right. So they came back clean, that's good. No hepatitis. It's like, I don't want to have to just start getting your treatments now. All right, genes, we've looked at candidate genes. What are some epigenetic stuff? Oh, there's this guy called Reland. That's actually responsible for that organization stuff we were talking about earlier, Jason, about that like migration and things. And so if your Reland is reduced, if the expression of that is reduced, your the organization of your brain is not going to be the way that it should. Not a big deal. Let's see. We're doing all right on time. Oh, I love the name of this gene. It's called DISC1. No, that's fine. It stands for disrupted in schizophrenia. That's how they named this gene. They found that folks who have schizophrenia, this gene's disrupted. So they said, we'll call it DISC. I don't know, it's like the least creative name for
I like it, it's straightforward.
Yeah,
it is
Yeah,
straightforward,
yeah,
right?
actually,
But what do you call it in folks? I mean, but if you don't have schizophrenia, it's not, but it's still called DISC. I mean, it's still, you know, it's a different allele of DISC, but it's still called DISC1, right? What's interesting about this is, again, it codes for a number of proteins that are responsible for neural development, right? So if you start screwing around with some of the locations of these, you can get some problems. We've already talked about sort of these, you know, that's setting up to be vulnerable. Complications during pregnancy can actually be a problem if there's oxygen deprivation, drug use, infections, if you've got any sort of hormone issues, right, beyond what, you know, and you think, well, definitely if you're pregnant you have hormone issues, but, you know, like abnormal situations, malnutrition, viral infections, a lot of that during that second trimester. That's when you got to stay clean. First and third, do whatever you want. So then you got your cytokines getting involved, all kinds of things. Early infancy, so Corey, here are some things that you can look for, you know, when your kids are younger. Apathy, right? If you kind of reduce responsiveness to verbal commands. Have I said anything yet that tells you this is schizophrenia, not something else? Not really, right? I mean, it's still kind of difficult temperament, poor sensory motor performance. I mean, that's sort of indicative of all kinds of problems, right? You're not really narrowing anything down. So good luck on that. And again, there's that excessive synaptic pruning, right? Don't worry about that too much. We already talked about the two-hit business, about that environmental effect that can happen later. All kinds of stuff. You guys are pretty familiar with that. We already talked about animal models. I just didn't flip through the slides. We talked about the amphetamine-induced issue. So if you give rats amphetamine or mice, they'll start doing a lot of like sniffing, licking, gnawing, right? Kind of that repetitive. Humans probably won't do that. Those specific behaviors, they'll do different behaviors, but it's the same. Sometimes they'll do the same behaviors, but sometimes they're different. Species models, doesn't matter. Again, this mimics only the positive symptoms. There's a hypoglutamate model. This is actually kind of interesting, where they'll give rats PCP or ketamine, right, which can induce some behaviors in rodents similar to schizophrenia, right? This sort of brought about a whole new idea of thinking about schizophrenia. Typically, we've considered only the dopaminergic aspects, right? We go, oh, you've got too much dopamine, and that's definitely what's causing the problem. Sort of the problem with that is like, well, not really do you have too much dopamine. It's like too much dopamine in some places, but not enough dopamine in the others, right? And so, you know, when you think about some of the issues with the mesolimbic versus the mesocortical pathway, the dopamine levels are different. But what's kind of interesting is glutamate actually controls dopamine release in both of those circuits, but in opposite directions. So if you get rid of dopamine, one of those, glutamate, sometimes glutamate excites an inhibitor, and then it causes inhibition. And sometimes it just excites a cell directly, and it causes release. And when you remove that glutamate, then you have the opposite. So you have inhibition where you used to have excitation, and excitation where you used to have inhibition. And so you can get different levels of dopamine that way by wiring up your circuits differently. Did that make sense? I've got diagrams. Hey, who loves vacuous chewing movements? That seems like a fun test. This is, mouth and facial dyskinesias. This is what they will do is, this is to test for preventing or the likelihood of tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia is typically kind of like lip smacking and tongues moving and kind of mouth movements in humans who've been on antipsychotics for a long time. So you give rats antipsychotics for a while, they do the same thing. So that's why you don't want tardive dyskinesia. Typically it's not curable or reversible. Some folks do see some improvement over time though. Dyskinesia. Oh, here's the attentional shifting task. We already talked about how that works, but it's basically just rodent version of the Wisconsin card sorting. Prenatal inflammation, we talked about this. We're not going to ask you too much about specific ways to make that happen. Genetic models, we talked about that. Oh, dopamine hypothesis, we didn't want to talk about this. So the dopamine hypothesis, we said, hey, too much dopamine, and that's a bad thing. So we'll give folks dopamine antagonists. That's your kind of standard antipsychotic approach, right? Not a big deal. Seems to work on those positive symptoms of schizophrenia. But here's like sort of the newer way of looking at this is a dopamine imbalance hypothesis, right? Because it says that these symptoms are due because you have less dopamine function in the mesocortical system and more in the mesolimbic, right? And that is why you have some of the positive versus negative symptoms, right? There's these two different brain circuits that are involved, which is kind of interesting if you think about this. The mesocortical and the mesolimbic systems, I mean, these are involved in different sort of mechanisms, different things going on, and reducing dopamine in mesocortical connections, that would definitely cause you some problems. You're connecting to the cortex, right? It's definitely cause you some thought disorders, some problems there. Definitely going to kind of make you withdraw socially, right? So that cortical sort of connections are not what they need to be. The mesolimbic, that's going to be going from where, Jessica, where you think our target is, the nucleus accumbens, right?
What's the TVA that it's connected to?
The VTA?
VTA.
Yeah, that's the ventral tegment.
TVA. To be announced. I'm close.
That is true. So you would think, go ahead, Jason.
So when dopamine, this may be a dumb question, when it's released in one area in the brain, does it circulate through the other areas? I mean, so is it like or does it stay pretty local and then get reabsorbed?
It's going to stay fairly local.
So that's why you have different levels in different areas.
Absolutely, and this is why also, if I give you a dopamine antagonist, because an antagonist works systemically,
okay,
it's not localized, right? So when I give you a drug, it works everywhere at once. So if I give you something that blocks dopamine, it blocks dopamine everywhere, not just in the mesolimbic, but also in that nigrostriatal pathway, which is why you can develop Parkinsonism from taking an antipsychotic. And the reverse happens if I give you a dopamine agonist. It's not only going to increase dopamine in that nigrostriatal pathway so you can have smooth movements, it's going to increase dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway, which is going to give you hallucinations. Because drugs that you take work systemically. You have neurotransmitter release is going to be local.
Local. and
Yeah.
reabsorbed
And
or-
yeah, because you have that reuptake process, you have the MAOI, right? You have the enzymes that break it down. It's going to really be contained at that synapse, or in this case, kind of a brain region, because you're going to have a bunch of synapses maybe activated. But yeah, it's not. If you release dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, it's not going to diffuse its way to your cortex, right? Because of those mechanisms that are going to take care of that reuptake and enzymatic degradation. That's a good question. But that makes perfect. I mean, that concept explains why systemic drugs that work everywhere cause some change where you want it, but not enough. But the wrong change elsewhere. And why you can again have those two different levels. We already talked about neurodevelopment. Not a big deal, but some of this is saying that you actually might have more cells in the mesolimbic system, in the mesocortical. We do want to think about glutamate, right? Because so if we go back a step from the dopamine, the glutamate might actually be explaining what's going on here, right? And that might work. I thought I had a diagram that would help. Well, hey, there you go. That's the nucleus accumbens, right? So these green are like glutamate cells, right? And so these are in the prefrontal cortex. And so if you're normal, normal healthy individual, this green cell comes down and it activates this inhibitory cell in the VTA, which sort of inhibits your cell projecting to the nucleus accumbens, and we're not getting that massive spike of dopamine there, right? However, we are getting dopamine coming from this cell because this glutamate cell is activating this guy, which goes from the VTA back to your cortex. And so then you're getting some activity there. That dopamine release is going to occur here at the top, right, which is in your prefrontal cortex, so your prefrontal cortex is working properly. In an individual who has schizophrenia, we're thinking about that hypofrontality, right? So frontal cortex is not working well. This guy is no longer exciting this inhibitory cell, so instead what you're getting is a massive dump of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, right? That's going to be responsible for those positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And instead of getting this massive dump of dopamine here, you're not getting any dopamine dumped back into the prefrontal cortex. That's going to be responsible for those negative symptoms.
Is this just theory, or have they actually mapped this?
Somewhere in between. I wouldn't say that this is definitely 100% the proven mechanism. It does help because you can. One of the things that helps with this, they do studies where they will induce. So again, if you NMDA, what do we know about NMDA? That's a glutamate receptor, right? And we can screw around with that with ketamine. And if you give rats drugs that will interfere with that ketamine, you can prevent sort of the onset of those induced schizophrenic-like symptoms that happened when we gave them ketamine or PCP. So we do know that preventing the disruption of this circuit does prevent the induced development of schizophrenic-like symptoms. Does that make sense? It was kind of a long story there for something. So there you go. But it's actually kind of exciting, right? I think it is. Because now we can actually start to think about targeting that glutamate system a little bit. The problem with that is, I don't want to dump a bunch of glutamate in somebody's brain. Because then, what are those things called? Seizures. Yeah, they have one of those. And kind of, again, because, Jason, if I give you a drug that increases glutamate, it increases glutamate everywhere, right? It's not just in the frontal cortex. Remember that time I talked to you guys about bespoke receptors? You looked at me weirdly. This is exactly where bespoke receptors would be beautiful, right? Because I could put some bespoke receptors just in your prefrontal cortex, and then give you whatever pill I wanted to open that, and we could mimic that glutamate system in that localized area. Because we would only have receptors there for this, made up drug that we put in. So that's exciting, right? Just wait. That's going to be the cure to everything. Trust me, Sierra. What do we know about antipsychotics? Here's your sort of classic antipsychotics, right? They have those nice 3 rings, nothing to worry about, right? Do you know how to read this chart, Destiny? Why did you laugh at that, Kristen?
Because that looks awful.
Yeah, so here's the base structure, and then this is your R group, this is your R1 group, and this is your R2 group. So for each of these drugs, you would want to hang this guy here at R1, and then you would hang this guy here at R2. But that center 3-ring structure is going to be the same for all those drugs. It's pretty exciting, right? Now it all makes sense to you.
Lots of atoms.
I will, well, lots of atoms. I probably will ask you, Jessica, to redraw all of these on the exam.
I'm not gonna do that.
Don't be sad.
I'll just put a sad face in. That's not that big.
That's what I should do. I should come in here with just drug, like, if I had, next time I teach this class, guys, what I'm gonna do for the final, I'm just gonna, like, print off a joke exam, and that joke exam is just gonna be drug structures, and then a list of drug names. And
Until one of us like passes out or has a seizure or something. Like,
But
do
do
it
it
next
to
time.
the
I'll do it next time.
Yes, do it
Watch.
next time.
The next group would love that.
Yeah.
They would.
They're even worse than we are.
You want to see a whole group of people cry at once?
As a matter of fact, I do.
Yeah,
do it.
I figured
Yeah,
you would rack
some
up.
of these groups that come through, some of these classes, some of you guys are more relaxed than others. You guys are fairly laid back compared to the last group I taught.
Oh, that's like really nice.
Yeah, that's as
They
close
were
as you get to
first
a
years though
compliment.
in their defense.
They were
So,
first and second years when they took this class. You guys might have
I think we would have been that
been
way
problems then
then.
too.
I don't give a fuck when you're in the trough.
What about, do all of those,
out.
because I've heard the like Thorazine shuffle before. Like, do they have,
Yeah.
do they have similar, do they have similar side effects, like all of them, or is it just Thorazine that makes them do that?
For the most part, they're gonna have similar side effects. Some are gonna be worse than others, and some of these are more likely to be prescribed than others, right?
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna ask too, because like, you can switch your antidepressant, so if you have a bad reaction with an SSRI, you can try an SNRI, and hopefully you will not have that.
Yeah.
So there's nothing you can do with antipsychotics, they're all in the
Let's try
same
different.
class.
I mean, some people tolerate particular antipsychotics better than others, and so they will. What you will see quite often is there's actually a study. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there was a study that looked at different antipsychotics, and what they found was that most of the time people had to shift to a different antipsychotic. Either it wasn't effective, or the side effect profile, was too much. They started growing breasts and lactating or something. They're like, I don't think I'm gonna do that. So they switched to a different side effect.
There's nothing you can do about like supportive dyskinesia and stuff like that.
At some point, no. I mean, it's really, hold on, we should probably talk side effects, right? So here's like side effects of different drugs, different antipsychotics that you might have. But let's see, positive symptoms. Parkinsonism, we talked about that. Not a big deal. Tardive dyskinesia. This is what I wanted to show you, Kristen. I know, right? So you look at this, is really depressing. So by the time you have been on drugs for 25 years, antipsychotics, you've got almost a 70% chance of developing tardive dyskinesia. Now, you think, well, man, that's a long time. Why is somebody on drugs that long? When were they diagnosed with schizophrenia? 20. Let's say they were 20. And how long do people live in the U.S. these days?
70.
I just forgot something.
Well, we're all going to stare and see what it is. Is there anything good in it? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's not unreasonable for you to be on an antipsychotic for decades, right? Because again, there's no cure for schizophrenia. Even if you've been on that just for 10 years, you've got almost a 50% chance of developing tardive dyskinesia. That's pretty bad, right? I mean, that's kind of depressing. Yeah, I mean, right? That's why they're really working on some of these other treatments. Other things that can happen when you block dopamine, there are some neuroendocrine effects. decreased sex drive, no menstruation. Growth hormone's going to be inhibited. Not so much of a problem if you're like diagnosed when you're 30, but again, if you're 13, 14, 15 and you start screwing around with growth hormone, right? That's kind of a time when you're using growth hormone, right? So that can be problematic if you're giving these kids antipsychotics, right? That work on that, they can have some growth issues. Weight gain, that's a big problem, right? People start gaining weight. Well, it's definitely the government making me gain weight, right, through those laser tubes. It's all that extra mechanics they put in me, right? All those microchips weighing me down. There you go. Also, you have trouble regulating your body temperature. That's not good. It's because it has some cholinergic effects there on that sympathetic nervous system and so forth. There are some life-threatening side effects of your antipsychotics. One of those is neuroleptic. By the way, neuroleptic is a sort of an old word for antipsychotics. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome, right? That's what they say. Fever, rigidity, altered consciousness, autonomic nervous system instability, right? So a lot of that's getting screwed up. Now, this may or may not kill you if you figure it out fast enough, right? You can get some treatment, but definitely can knock you down. All kinds of GI problems. Again, because they're those like cholinergic issues. Dry mouth, blurred vision, stuff like that. Nice chart showing that. Let's see. One interesting, antipsychotics really, you're not going to become addicted to those, right? They don't really have any abuse potential.
They sound so fun.
I
don't
know,
want to
right on. Oh yeah. Just wait on the weight gain and growing breasts. That's going to be thrilling for you.
Can't stop.
Yeah, just keep taking. On top of that, because it's knocking down your dopamine, obviously it's not going to be addictive, right? I mean, that's a no-brainer. So you don't have to worry about anybody abusing antipsychotics. I mean, that's for sure. So there you go. Also, there's not really any sort of like withdrawal or abstinence syndrome issue, right? They do seem to have a very long half-life, and so that seems to be where there's like a natural tapering effect, when you discontinue the use of your drugs, your antipsychotics. Now, like newer effects, they're working on like partial agonist, partial antagonist, Abilify sort of being the prototypical drug here for your partial dopamine agonist, right? And so how this works is it's like almost as good as dopamine, but not quite, right? So if you are totally short on dopamine in one place, or I'm sorry, I was thinking about it. Yeah, so an agonist. So if you're short on dopamine in one place, like a mesocortical, right? This will help you a little bit, right? Because it will increase the amount of dopamine or dopamine-like substances there. But if you think about another place that you're like too high on dopamine, right? Well, this guy's actually going to compete for that dopamine slot, and because it's not quite as good as dopamine, it's actually going to drop your function a little bit there, which is fine, like in the mesolimbic pathway, where you've got too much dopamine, right? So it's like not as good, but almost as good, but better than nothing in the other places, right? So Abilify is a pretty good, sort of a newer approach, right? And the side effects aren't so bad. I don't know, you guys seen anybody who's schizophrenic that's on Abilify or somebody's on Abilify?
I have a client who is a teenager. That's why I've been sitting here thinking, what is Wellbutrin? I can't remember.
Was it SNDRI or something?
Yeah.
Well,
Everybody knows that.
That's on the dopaminergic
Let's see.
pathway, and not the serotonergic.
It's not Yeah, but I mean, so is it blocking dopamine, or is it just increasing the amount of dopamine that you have in your system?
let's see what the Wellbutrin website does. That doesn't tell us anything. That looks ridiculous. We'll look at this. Yeah, that's it, right? It's an antidepressant. That's pretty awesome, right? What? Yeah, it's unrelated to all of these, right? It's completely different, which is kind of interesting. Let's see. Dosage administration. Side effects, all kinds of weird side effects. Hoping to see what the mode of action was for you guys. Alright, let's try something else. Didn't like that website. Alright, we'll just try Wikipedia. I'll trust it for this. Right? It works on your norepinephrine and dopamine system. It's a reuptake inhibitor, which sounds pretty good. Also, it works on your nicotinic receptors. It's an antagonist there, which means if you were to take nicotine, then it would not allow the nicotine to open those channels. Right? So it's an atypical antidepressant. Doesn't really work like much else. Right?
Because I have a client who was taking 450 milligrams of Wellbutrin. Then a month ago they dropped it down to 300, but they also have 20 or 25 milligrams of Abilify. They're taking too, and Trazodone, and they have an implant for birth control in their arm, and there's like 2 or 3 other medicines that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, and they hallucinate.
Yeah.
Yeah, they hear things and see things, and it's been happening for years.
Jeez. So what were they on? So one, I mean, you've already told me they're on Wellbutrin, right? So that's definitely going to increase dopamine levels.
Yeah.
What was the other drug?
Abilify, so they're on that.
All right, so
They're
we already
on-
talked about it.
On Trazodone.
And they're a teenager?
Trazodone, oh geez, let's see. Now it is a serotonin antagonist and a reuptake inhibitor. It's kind of interesting.
But then, like I said, she also has that birth control that's implanted in your arm that lasts for 3 years. And those, just don't, like me personally, those make me nervous.
Yeah.
I don't know how that would impact, because we were talking about estrogen, and I don't know what's in those and how that would impact hallucinations and things.
Yeah, I mean,
But there's like 2 or 3 other drugs that I can't remember off the top of my head right now.
that's a lot for somebody to be taking as a teenager.
And so this is kind of interesting because they reduced the Wellbutrin from 450 milligrams to about 300 a month ago, and that's when she says that's when she had her last hallucination.
When they reduce the amount. Makes some sense because again, Wellbutrin is going to increase your dopamine levels.
Yeah.
Dropping that dopamine level down a little bit is going to potentially reduce the likelihood that you're going to have those.
But I think she's probably going to keep, I think they're going to keep I don't think.
It's possible. I mean, that's a lot of stuff for somebody to be on.
Yeah, and there's like a history of both parents were using substances when she was born.
Oh, jeez.
Mom apparently heard things hallucinated too. And I don't know if that's from substances or from actual
So she might have at least one parent that's schizophrenic. Plus she, I mean, you know, basically everything we talked about today. Good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, I mean, I just mean, you got a lot of work to do there, because that's gonna be a tough situation. You know, you've got multi, yeah, that's tough. What do you do in those, I don't know, what do you do in those cases? All right, so what are we gonna do with the last 7 minutes of class? Da-da-da-da. I mean, this guy, like clozapine, anybody familiar with that one? Yeah.
Mine's on that too.
Yeah, it does a lot of stuff actually. Serotonin, histamine, dopamine, it's all over the place. It's a big one. Let's see, what else we got? Don't worry.
What is that? Is that different than Haldol?
Risperidone. I
Yeah.
have a lot of people.
Yeah. So it's the same. What is at the end of? Oh, why does this computer freeze every time?
Don't at the end.
This was it's the same time too.
Maybe it does like checkups at that time or something.
That's what I was getting ready to say. I was wondering if they're like
Scheduled
pushing
at
through
that
some
time.
updates.
But that's why on Wednesdays, skip class, and then on Tuesdays it doesn't happen.
Maybe it's just, you know, it might be the, I wonder if the recording is like now so massive that.
That helps.
That's the one that always works. Apparently it didn't. Isn't that weird? It like left my mouse on there.
Yeah,
Alright.
that is weird.
Well, all the same. I don't want to do that. End that task. Okay, so that was really the last thing I wanted to talk about anyway. We'd already talked about the other stuff. No, those are some great questions.